Photorealism in 3D art is something a lot of artists struggle with, and for good reason. It's really hard to recreate something in real life in a 3D application, especially if you don't know exactly what you're doing or how the real world works. So in this video, I'm basically just going to go over how I make my renders as realistic as possible. I'm not completely at photorealism yet, but I'm pretty close. So I feel like I can give some advice to some people out there who are struggling with making realistic or photorealistic renders. So let's get right into this. So there's a few things that go into making a photorealistic render, and those things are lighting, composition, assets, textures, HDRIs, shadows, post-processing, and color correction. Those are the main things that you're going to want to focus on to give your renders a more realistic edge and a more cinematic, photorealistic look. So, getting started, let's start with lighting. I'm basically going to explain how lighting works, how shadows work, and pretty much everything you need to know about Blender's lighting system and how to work with it. So, let's go into Blender and I'll show you guys what light is. So lighting in any 3D software can be pretty difficult to get the hang of, especially if you haven't studied lighting or you don't know how lighting works. It's very obvious that adding a light into a 3D scene is going to light up the models and it's going to light up everything that it needs to light up. But how does that actually work? How does it affect the objects, and how does the properties of the light affect how the light puts out light? So, we're going to be focusing on cycles for this video. I can make another video on Eevee if you guys would like to see that. But right now we're going to be focusing on cycles just because cycles is the main render engine I use. And I'm pretty familiar with how lighting works in it. So, I have this very basic scene laid out. It's literally just default materials, default background, but it has the default point light. So we're going to be using this light as an example right now. If we go into render view, we can see what we get immediately. We can see how this is working. So basically we have this light up here, this position. The light is basically casting light right here. It's kind of hitting the front of this sphere, and we can see we have the shadow under it and the shadow reaching out behind it. So if we go down to this lighting panel, we can see all of our light settings right here. Basically the main ones that you're going to want to change are color, power, and radius. Max bounces, you don't really need to worry about that. That can be left as default. But pretty much the most important ones are radius and power. The color can be anything you want. It won't affect how the actual light reacts. So also excuse me if I'm sniffling a lot. I know it can get annoying, but I'm still recovering from strep throat, so just bear with me. But yeah, so immediately if we start adjusting the power, let's say we change this to like 50,000. We can immediately see the power is what controls the strength of the light. So I'm going to turn this back down to 1,000 because that's the default. But what we can notice first off is the shadow. So right now this shadow, we can see we have a little bit of a soft edge right here, but for the most part the shadow is pretty sharp. That is to do with the size of the light. We can see right here this is a point light. It's a pretty small light. It has a radius of 0.1 meters. So what happens if we increase that radius? Let's say we increase it to 0.5. So if you look at the shadow right here, we can notice that the soft part of the shadow is extended a lot, and we have a lot less of that harsh, sharp shadow right here. And now if we keep increasing this radius, we can see the shadow gets softer and softer. So that's what the radius does. We see immediately the light is a lot bigger than it was. If we turn it back down to 0.1, we can see we have that soft shadow back. And then obviously you have the position of the light itself. It's going to affect how the light is cast on it and how the shadow is cast on it. Like if we move this around to the very top, the shadow is going to be very, very harsh, very just under it. But if we increase the radius again, we can see that the shadow gets softer. So that's the point light. So how do other light sources react? Well, basically other light sources react the same way in terms of lighting and shadows properties, but the shape of the light and how they output and how they diffuse light is a little bit different. So if you're not familiar with Blender's lamps or Blender's lights, basically we have a few to choose from. So we have a point light, which is the light that I just explained, a sunlight, which simulates sunlight, a spotlight, and an area light. They're all pretty much self-explanatory. Area lights are for lighting up an area. Spotlights, or if you want like a spotlight on something, sunlights are used for outdoor scenes or anything that you need sun for, and point light is just for lighting up a small area. Point lights aren't very good at lighting up huge areas. That would be an area light. So let's go with the sunlight, because the sunlight, especially if you're making outdoor realistic scenes, the sunlight is probably going to be your most important one. So let's go ahead and add a sunlight in. So when you add a sunlight in Blender, it's automatically going to be pointing down, and no matter where you put the sunlight, it's always going to be the same. No matter where you put the sunlight in your scene, it doesn't matter. It's not going to cast light on a specific part. It is the sun. It's going to light up the whole scene no matter where it is. But what we can change, though, is the angle of the sunlight. So you can see right now, I'm going to move this back over here. We can see the sunlight is pointing down right now, meaning that we have the shadow directly under this sphere. So if we look over at our light properties again, you'll see that the radius is gone, and instead we have this angle. So if we change the angle of the sunlight, let me change it to maybe 90 degrees. We can see that the shadow is gone pretty much from this, because it's not casting, or it's not directly on it. Now, to be honest, I usually keep this angle the same, and I manually rotate it by just clicking on the light and then just hitting R and rotating it around, because I find that's a lot better. But basically, what we can notice, I want to point out a few things right here, is this shadow is insanely sharp. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, I just explained with a point light that increasing the radius is going to give you a softer shadow, and the shadow is going to look better. Well, we obviously don't have that radius option with the sunlight. So what's up with that? Well, if you go outside, anywhere pretty much, and the sun's out, doesn't matter if it, well, midday would be the best, because that's when the sun is at its strongest, you'll notice that the shadows that are being cast from the objects in real life are always going to have a sharp shadow. The sun is never going to cast a sharp shadow. And the reason for that is because the sun, compared to the distance of the earth, how far away we are from the sun is pretty small, distance-wise. The sun obviously isn't small, but distance-wise, it's kind of small. But it is also outputting a ton of light, because, you know, it's the sun, so it's going to output a ton of light. So that's going to result in very, very harsh shadows, because the radius of the sun isn't that big compared to how far away we are from it. So you have this tiny light source, and then you have a bunch of power coming out of it, a bunch of light radiating out of it. So that's going to cast very sharp shadows, and that's how the sun works in real life. So you're never going to get a soft shadow from the sun, no matter what time of day it is, no matter where the earth is at in the solar system. You're always going to have sharp shadows from the sun. So that's how the sunlight works. Basically, you just have the angle. You can rotate it different angles. Obviously, if it's pointing up away from it, it's not casting light anywhere down, so it's going to be completely dark. But yeah, that's how the sunlight works. So the next light is going to be our spotlight. So if we move our spotlight up, we can see that we have a little bit of light, but it's very, very weak. So we have some more options for our spotlight. So you can see right here we have our radius back, and we also have our power. So I'm gonna go ahead and change the power up to like 1,000. And so now we can see that we have this direct spotlight on it. And so spotlights usually are not at an angle. Obviously you can put the spotlight at an angle, you can rotate it, but usually spotlights are straight down on a focus object. So what can we do with this? So if we look around, we can see that the shadow is pretty harsh, but what's around here where the light is pretty soft. So if we increase the radius to maybe 0.75, we can see that the outside ring gets softer, and also the inner shadow gets softer. It's basically the same thing I explained for point lights. Bigger the radius, the softer the shadows are going to be. But now what we have is these beam shapes. So if we look at the cone itself, we can see that by default, These are very close together, the inner and outer ring, and then we have the angle of the cone. So if we change the spot size, we can see that the cone gets shorter, but the spot itself gets bigger. That's because it still has to be a cone. The light is still needs to be in the same position, so it's gonna get shorter and wider compared to what you need it. So you can make a huge spotlight over an entire area, or you can make something very, very small like this. So I'm pretty sure it was at 45 before. And then we have the blend. So if we click show cone right here, we can see the exact cone where the light is coming off of. And then we can change the blend. The blend is basically that inner and outer ring between these. So if we increase the blend, we can see it blends a lot smoother through these. And if we decrease the blend, we can see that it's just completely gone, and we just have this huge ring that just kind of falls off right here. So that's how the spotlight works. So now, moving on to the next light, we have area lights. Area lights are quite possibly one of my favorite lights on Blender, just because they're so easy to use and you can pretty much do anything with them. So if we bring the area light up, we can see right now it's casting a little bit of light. I'm going to go ahead and change this to 1000. But right now, this is how the area light is looking. I'm actually going to change this down to 500 probably. So we can see how this area light is working right here. It's basically, we have this square light, and it's just lighting wherever it needs to light. Wherever this beam is pointing, that's where it's going to light. So if I move this over, and then I just kind of rotate it like this, we can see that it's now lighting up this area, and anything behind it is darker. We still have some light behind it because it's diffusing the light all around, global illumination and whatnot. But we can see right here, we have a pretty soft shadow. Well, not pretty soft. We have a moderately soft shadow. Same thing, except instead of radius, it's size. If we change this to maybe 5 meters, we can see the shadow gets a ton softer. The size is basically the equivalent to the radius and anything else. And then we have, let's change this up to maybe 2, just so we have a little bit of a softer shadow. And then we have the shape. It's not really important. It does cast light into certain shapes, like this is casting light in a square. But typically, you don't need to change this. But depending on your specific lighting setup, you might want to change this. So shapes we have are square and then rectangle. The rectangle is rectangle. Then we have a disc. This is just a circle light, and an ellipse. This is the rectangle equivalent of the circle. So you can see it didn't really change much because, like I said, you don't really need to change it. And then we have the beam shape. The beam shape, we can change the spread on this. Let's change it to 90. We can see that it basically focuses the beam in a lot tighter of an area. So imagine it like we were working with the spotlights. When we changed the cone size, and then it changed the where the light is being put. I don't really know what I just said there, but you probably get the point. But changing this changes how much the light spreads. We change like 45 degrees. We're going to see that the light is just coming off of there. And then we can see a little bit better how the lighting changes depending on what shape the lighting is. So if I just put this on 1 degree, we can see that the light itself is casting in whatever shape it is. It's just you can't really see that a lot of the times because the light's being diffused so much. But I'm going to put this back on 180 degrees, and that is that. So, the next thing that we're going to want to do, the next thing that we're going to want to explain is composition. So, composition is one of the biggest things that you could possibly put into your render. It's very easy to just slap assets into a 3D scene and call it a day. And they might look really good. That you might have a seemingly photorealistic render. But composition is basically guiding your viewer to where they need to look. It's telling your viewer, whoever's looking at your artwork or your render, hey, you need to look at this because this is the focal point of the image. So how do you do composition? How do you know where to put everything? How do you know where everything should be laid out? How do you know what looks good? So I'm gonna open a project file that I made the other day. It's a hot springs. It's gonna be the thumbnail for this video probably. But yeah, we have this. So looking at the scene, we can see it's a pretty small scene. This is the same project file I used for my cinematic tutorial. I just created something else out of it, so that's why this building is just here randomly. But if we look at this scene, I don't have any kind of overlays on right now, but looking at this, even without the render, you're probably looking at that waterfall in the pond over there. And I know that because, one, it's not even the biggest thing in the scene, but it is the main element of the scene. So, how did I go about this composition? So, there are things called composition guides. There's a ton of different composition guides. The rule of thirds is basically the go-to for everybody, but you don't have to use the rule of thirds. There's like harmonious triangles, golden triangles, center composition, everything like that. So Blender has a handy feature where in your viewport you can use composition guides. It'll overlay it over your camera. So how do you enable that? So first, if we go to our camera object in the scene, and then we go down to the camera properties, somewhere in here, it's in viewport display. Under viewport display, if we go down to composition guides, we can see we have all these composition guides here. So I use the rule of thirds for this one, but you can use any of these really, and your composition should be alright. So how do you read these composition guides though? Like, what do you do with them? So if we turn on my overlays right here, you can't really see it because I have a lot of lamps and stuff going on. But if you follow my mouse cursor, you can see that there's a dotted line right here that goes down that intersects with another dotted line going across, and then down here there's another dotted line, and then down here, or there's another intersection right here, and there's another intersection right here. So this is the rule of thirds. It's called the rule of thirds because it's in thirds. The camera view is in thirds. So what is this? What are you looking at right now? So basically, the way these intersections are lined up is where you want your focal elements to be. Looking at it right now, it doesn't really look like there's a bunch of focal elements in these, but there actually are, and I'll explain that. So first and foremost, if we go down here to the bottom, or the bottom left one, we can see that it's at the waterfall, and it's right at where the waterfall meets the water, because that's where I want the viewer to look, really. I want them to look where the waterfall hits the water, and I want them to look at the water and be like, oh, that's water. That's where that one is, because that's the main focal element in this. And then over here on the right, we have it coming up just off of this rock, and the way these rocks are laid out is very specific, because if you notice, if you follow my cursor down here at the bottom right of the camera viewport, we can see that the rocks take this kind of trail that come down here, where it's pretty flat right here. It rises a little bit right here, and then this rock rises it up even more. And then there's a intersection right here above the rock and above these two flowers, because I also want you to look over here, because these rocks look really pretty, and I want you to look at the rocks. So I want you to follow the rocks over here, back to the water, looking at the flowers. And then we have the top two intersections, and these are put almost at the peak of this mountain. You can't really see it because I have a volume cube, but it's over here on this mountain, so when you're looking in the background, you're going to look at the mountains. And then over here, it's on the edge of this mountain, right where the sky is. The sky is going to be right here, so you're going to follow this, and then you're going to see the sky over here. And we also have this tree that's going to guide you to the peak of this mountain once you're looking over here, because the intersection is like right here. So you're always going to, when you have your composition, you're going to want to use that composition guide, but you're also going to want to have complementary composition that guides the viewer to something else. Like we have this rule of thirds here, and we have all of our focal elements we want, but again, I also have these rocks that are going to guide the viewer from the edge of the screen into the middle of it. And we have this tree stump that's going to guide the viewer over here to the sky, and we have these plants and stuff. and different stuff like that. You're always going to want to guide your viewer from the edge of your render into whatever your focal point is. So that's something very important about that. But we also have a ton of different composition guides. For example, we have a center composition guide, which is basically literally just the center. We have a diagonal composition guide, which would guide the viewers from the four corners of the image into the center. We have the golden ratio, which is, it's kind of like the rule of thirds, but this middle square is a little bit smaller than all the other ones. We have golden triangles. This is basically like just like the diagonal one. Triangle B is basically the same thing. And then we have the harmonious triangles, which have intersections right here where this tree is, down here where this rock is, and then we have triangle B, which is up here in the sky, and then down here where this rock is. So composition guides, you can use pretty much any one you want. It depends on your scene and how you want your scene laid out. But just keep in mind, you're going to want to guide your viewers over to wherever your focal point is and wherever it needs to be. So next, in creating your photorealistic render is textures, or not textures, assets. What assets you're using. So obviously, if you're using very low poly assets or very low quality assets, then it's not going to look very photorealistic. Even if your lighting is really good, lighting will definitely help a lot. Even if you don't have very good assets or you don't have very high polygon assets, lighting will complement that a lot. But to get the most photorealism, you're going to want your assets themselves to look photorealistic. So the assets that I use most of the time in my renders are from Quixel Megascans, because I usually don't make my assets myself, because I don't have the ability, I don't have the artistic ability to make photorealistic textures and photo scan assets all the time, or make rocks from scratch. I'm an artist. I just want to build my scenes up, and I just want to make my environments. So I use Quixel Megascans assets, and Quixel Megascans assets are really high quality assets. So you can obviously see we have quite a bit of good looking assets right here. So they do look kind of muddy because it's a lower polygon version, but the textures make up for that. So you're going to want to be using high quality assets with good and accurate geometry that are going to go over your scene. Another thing is what kind of assets you're using, scene specifically. You're not going to want to have a grassy meadows with some kind of canyon rocks, or you're not going to want to have a canyon with a spruce tree in it somewhere. You're not going to want to do that. You're going to want to make all your assets match. And if you have an asset that would look really good, but the texture or something is wrong, there are things like Quixel Mixer, which is a free program that I've made tutorials on before, that you can make your own texture. You don't even have to make your own texture. You can just take two textures, combine them together, and then make an entirely new looking asset. So one example that I've used before is I was making a snow scene a few months back, and I had this pile of logs. So we had this snow scene, and everything was covered in snow, and everything was looking good. And this pile of logs would have been very good because it was a snowy forest, but the logs didn't have any snow on them, so it looked very out of place. So I just took it in a mixer, and then I mixed it with a snow material, changed some settings to make it look like a snow was just on top of it. And I wound up with logs with snow on top of them, and then that fit the scene a lot better. So you're going to want to use accurate assets and photorealistic assets and assets that just make sense. And the next thing, and probably one of the most important things, is textures. So the textures of your object are going to define how your object looks. Obviously, they're a texture. So typically, I'm going to start with texture resolution first. Because I'm assuming you already have decent textures, because there's tons of places to get good textures, and I'll go into what type of textures you're going to need to use here in a minute. But texture resolution, basically, we can see if I just click on one of these assets, this texture resolution is 4K. 4K resolution is going to be pretty decent. It should be perfectly fine for any renders that you're trying to do. If you do have the higher texture resolution that you use, the more resources it's going to use from your computer. So if you have a very low-end computer, you're going to want to use a very low resolution texture. But if you have a very high-end beast computer, you can go all out and just go 8K, even maybe 16K textures if you have a godly computer. But there's really no point in doing that, especially if the object isn't directly like right up on the camera. Typically what I do is my objects because I have a mid-range computer. I have a GTX 1060 in my computer, but 8K textures really hog my computer, so I don't really use 8K textures. So I use 4K textures for mainly everything that's in the foreground. And then in the background, I will use probably a 2K texture because you're not going to be as close and you're not going to need as much detail into it. But obviously, if you want a very close-up shot of something, let's say you're just making a render that's a very close-up detail shot of something, you're probably going to want to use an 8K texture just to get that extra detail in there. And so now moving on to what type of textures you should use, there are all kinds of different types of textures. But the main texture category that you're going to want to be using is PBR. Now, I've done texturing tutorials. I've explained what PBR is, but I'm going to explain it again. PBR stands for physically based rendered, or physically based rendering. And basically, what it is it uses different texture maps to define how the texture should react based on how that texture would react in real life. So obviously this only works with materials that work in the real world. You're not going to really be able to get a PBR texture on some completely random texture. Stylized textures, yes, those will still work because they still will react a certain way to lighting, but it's typically materials that could exist in real life. So and I say stylized materials will work with that because if you paint something in a stylized style, you're still going to have that lighting there. So PBR textures and what they are, basically, if we go ahead and look at an asset right here, there's a few maps that we can use. So the first thing, the first asset or the first map is going to be your color map. I'm actually going to open an entirely new project for this just to show you guys the texture maps separately, so I don't want to render that entire scene again. But basically, I'm just going to take this plane and I'm going to apply a quick texture to it. And I have no Ringler add-ons, so this is going to be very, very fast. But let's just use this ground texture right here. And if we go into our rendered view, it's actually going to be an Eevee right now. And I don't want it to be an Eevee. So I'm going to switch to cycles, GPU. And we're just going to render this right here. But right now we can see this is how the texture looks right now. And you can see with all these maps right here, we have a pretty realistic looking texture. So obviously this isn't the most insanely detailed realistic texture of all time, but it's a realistic texture. It's reacting fine with lighting. So what are these maps? So first map we have is our color texture, our base color texture, or our albedo or diffuse, whatever you want to call it. It goes by a ton of different names, but this is basically your raw color data of the image. It's the flat color data of your image. So this is always going to be set to sRGB because it's color data. Anything that gives color data to your material is going to be set to sRGB color space. And if we control shift click on this, we can see that we're now viewing the raw color data of the image. So we can see we no longer have that lighting that's diffusing around it. We just have this whole thing lit flat. The next is our roughness shader, or our roughness map. And basically this uses white and gray values to define which parts are rough and which parts are not. So the darker parts are going to be less rough. It's either the darker or lighter parts are less or more rough. I don't know. I forgot which one. But one of them makes it more glossy and the other one makes it more rougher. So we can see that here. We can see we have the gray areas on the leaves and sticks and stuff, and the white areas on the mud. And then we have our normal maps. So normal maps, if we click on this, we can see that this looks pretty wild. If we take a look at our normal map, we can see that this kind of looks 3D. This kind of looks like there's geometry here, but there's not. That's because it's a normal map. So what a normal map does is it basically fakes geometry through a texture to give your material extra detail. It gives your material extra depth. Next is our displacement texture, which uses blacks, whites, and grays to indicate where the actual geometry should be displaced. So unlike a normal map, the displacement node actually displaces the geometry. So I can't really show that right now. Well, I can probably show that right now. If I subdivide this like 100 times, what we can do is we can go into our render view now. Material. We can see this is very, very high. Like the displacement's very, very strong. So I'm just going to change this to like 0.2, or maybe not 0.2, 0.05 ish. This is still very, very strong. But yeah, we can see the displacement map actually displaces the textures. So we can see in the gray darker parts it's lower down, and then in the white and gray parts it's higher up. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this displacement actually. And now if we just go into our regular material again, we can see that this is how our material is looking. So that's basically textures. Next thing is HDRIs. So HDRIs fall into our lighting category from the beginning, but I wanted to explain them separately because they work a little bit different than every other light. So to get an HDRI in Blender, you just would go to something like hdrihaven.com, download an HDRI to your computer, and then go over to the world settings under this color node, click this, and then change it to environment texture, and then just open whatever HDRI you want. So I have a HDRI already set or already downloaded on my computer, so I'm just gonna open that. And what we can see, what you probably noticed right away, is this is providing lighting data to our scene. So even if I take this light away, which is the only official light in the scene, we see that the scene is still lit. So HDRIs are basically a 360-degree image that provides real, accurate lighting data to your scene. So there's tons of different HDRIs, depending on what kind of environment you're going for. Depending on what scene you're trying to make, you're going to want to match your HDRI as closely as you can to that. So if you're making a very cinematic, gloomy forest, you're not going to want a very bright and sunny beach HDRI, if that makes sense. Depending on what type of HDRI you want, it's up to you. But just try to match it as closely as you can to your scene. But we can see we have a strength value here. Turning it down and turning it up obviously makes it lighter and darker. You can also adjust that depending on your scene, but I would recommend leaving this at 1 unless that's too strong. I wouldn't recommend going over 1 unless you really need to, because you could probably just use sunlights and stuff for that and stuff like that. So now what I want to do is I want to explain lighting in how to actually set up lighting in a scene. So if we go back to that hot springs render that I did before, how do you set what's the best way to set up lighting in an outdoor scene? So the first thing you're going to want to always have is your HDRI. So this HDRI is the exact same HDRI that I just showed, and the reason for that is because I really like the sky, how cloudy it is and stuff. I really like that, and it went really well with the scene, so I used it. The strength is still set on 1, it's the default value, but what we have is we have this sun lamp right here, and this sun lamp is set at a very, very high value. So with outdoor scenes, you're going to want to have a very high value sunlight, because the sun is obviously very, very bright. And the reason this is so high is we have this cube right here. So what is this cube? This cube is a volume cube. So volumetrics in Blender, It's very, very simple. You just add a volume cube. Under surface, make sure nothing's attached, and under volume, click principal volume, and then just change all the settings here. Typically, the only one I mess with is density because everything else is fine. You can change these to whatever you want, but this is how I do it. And just make sure the volume cube is pretty much taking up your entire scene, or whatever you want to be affected by the volume. So I have this over everything, obviously, so everything's being affected by volume. And if you're making outdoor renders, you're always going to want to have some sort of volumetrics. Obviously, you're not always going to have to go crazy with volumetrics unless you're making like a really foggy atmospheric scene. But you're always going to want to have some sort of volumetrics because the real world has volumetrics. If you look out in the distance, like even on a very, very clear day, at some point, if you could just look in the distance as far as you can without any kind of mountains or any kind of things stopping you from seeing, you'll see in the distance that it falls off. There is some sort of fog or volumetrics there. So you're always going to want to have some sort of volumetrics in your scene, and honestly, done correctly, volumetrics add a ton to scenes, especially outdoor scenes. And so with the higher the density of your volume, the stronger your volumetrics are, the less your light is going to work, because the more light is being absorbed and diffused by the volumetrics. So typically, if this scene didn't have a volume cube, I would probably set the strength to maybe 10. But since it does have a volume cube, I set it to 50. And so that's pretty much how I lit this scene. Lighting is also very finicky. I can't really say exactly how to set up lighting because that's very, very scene dependent. And it's very, very difficult, honestly. Lighting is one of my favorite and most hated things to do in 3D renders, because there's so many values and so many variables that go into lighting that it's just, you have to mess around with it. It's pretty much just trial and error. So just find the correct angle that you want your sun to be casting from. You can always mess around with this. There's no shame in fixing your lighting a billion times. You don't have to just have a lighting setup and then just stick with it. Feel free to just change whatever you need. This angle specifically I found worked really well because it has light coming over the water and then down through these rocks, and it just looks really good. So that's the lighting I did for this scene. So now we're going to talk about post-processing. So post-processing is one of the more important parts of after your render. So I post-process in Photoshop. So if I open up Photoshop right here, I can show you guys pretty much my my process of post-processing. So in Photoshop, let's say I open this, and then I just open let's say I just open my Hot Springs render. So this is the render that I've done already. It's already post-processed and everything, but I can still explain what I've done with this. I don't have the original image, unfortunately, to re-post-process, but I will explain what I've done. So, what the most important thing, well, one of the most things I start out with is color curves. So color curves basically give you a curve of your highlight or your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So adjusting the shadows will obviously bring your shadows out a lot more like this, and then bringing them up will make them a lot less. Will make the lights a lot brighter. And then your midtones are basically the middle values of your image. So bringing them up and down will just change the midtones of it. You can see that if we bring this down, the mountains in the back get more visible, but the foreground is very, very dark because originally the mountains in the background are very blown out. And then highlights are just all the highlights of your image where the where the lights are the most bright. Those are your highlights. So we can see if we bring this down again, where the lights are really, really bright on the mountains, that brings it down. But since the lighting is normally okay right here, this is very, very. I don't even know how to describe how this looks. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and delete that layer for now. Next thing I use is sometimes I use a brightness and contrast. Obviously, you probably know what brightness and contrast is. Brightness increases the brightness of your image, and then contrast increases the contrast of your image. Very, very self-explanatory. And then I have a color balance node. Typically, I will either use this or just use the photo filter node. Or not, I keep calling them nodes. They're adjustment layers. I'm so used to Blender. But depending on which one I find looks better is the one I'll use. Like sometimes I'll slap a cooling filter on it if I want more blue, or a different warming filter if I want more orange. But then sometimes if that just doesn't look good, I want to adjust it manually, I can use these sliders to adjust what the scene looks like that. And then next, what I do is my hue and saturation. Sometimes I'll mess with the saturation of the image, depending if I want it more vibrant or not. The hue I never mess with because that just sets your colors all wonky. I mean, if you're making art on acid, you can go ahead and go for that, because I'm pretty sure that would look cool. But we're not doing that. So next thing I do is I add my overlays. Now my overlays are, if we zoom in right here, we can see we have little dust particles right here. We have some mist right here. If we go up, we can see that we have clouds over here that weren't in the original render. Just different overlays like that. So to get overlays, typically I use mist overlays, dust overlays, rain overlays, snow overlays. Just depends on what I want to use in my scene. So to get an overlay, it's as simple as just going on Google and then pretty much just typing in, let's say we want to get a dust overlay. So we just type in dust overlay, then we go over here into images, and as long as it's not very low quality, any of these will work. Just make sure it's a black background. But what we can do is we can go to file and then place, and then I can just open a dust overlay. I'm going to use this one, and you just want to cover your image or cover wherever you want the overlay to be. And then we just place it, and then we go over here and then click lighten, and then that just lightens the dust overlay. Right now you can't see it that much on this because it's very blown out because there's a lot of lighting, but that's how you do an overlay. You can also change this to screen, which kind of gives it a little bit more visibility. It just depends. I've used both lighten and screen. Screen basically uses the colors in the background to overlay, and then lighten basically just takes the dark parts and then brightens them up. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete this layer, and that's pretty much it. Afterwards, whenever I do post my art on Instagram, I will edit the art through Instagram because I like how Instagram's color correction and photo editing is. But from the render to this is pretty much how I do it. So we can see that we have a very, very good lighting setup. Like I said, the sun comes down from here, hits the water, lights up these rocks. It looks really, really good. And we just have a lot of really high quality assets and textures. So you can see the 4K textures are pretty fine. They're completely fine. And then we have the 2K textures back here on the trees and stuff and the plants, and you can't even tell a difference because they're farther back. But yeah, another thing that I forgot to mention, that I probably should have mentioned, is your details in your render. You're always going to want to add details, especially if you're making an outside render, because you can never have too much detail, but you can go overboard with detail. So you don't want to pack in so much detail that it's distracting everything. It's distracting from everything else. Like, I don't want grass all up in my face and a bunch of twigs, but there's also enough detail in this to where the scene is filled out. So we can see we have this grass on the rocks right here. We have all the flowers and stuff. We have over here we have rocks all on this. These are a separate particle system. We have some plants coming out of the water over here. We have some more grass over here. And we just have a bunch of little tiny plants over here. We have some plants right here. And just different stuff like that. Details are very, very important. If you go outside, there's tons of details. There you can never get as much detail as going outside, but you can get enough detail to where the scene looks good. So with that being said, that's pretty much my entire workflow for making photorealistic or near photorealistic renders. If you guys did enjoy the video, please hit it with a thumbs up and consider subscribing. That really helps me out. I just hit 4,100 subscribers. Thank you guys so much. That means so much to me. My birthday is tomorrow, so well, it's gonna be my birthday when this video is up probably. But thanks guys so much for watching. My name is Michael from Polygon Island. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you can take some of these tips and put them into your next render. Leave some comments. I always love reading comments. And yeah, thanks guys so much for watching. My name is Michael from Polygon Island, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.